Welcome to the October meeting of the ASCE Dallas branch. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all our members and guests. Before we begin the main program, we wanted to cover a few branch announcements.
Today, the ASCE Dallas branch would like to take the opportunity to recognize all of our new life members. Advancement to life membership in the American Society of Civil Engineers is an honor and unique accomplishment reserved for individuals who have made a long-time contribution and commitment to the society and the profession. Furthermore, these members have reached the age of 65 years and have paid dues in any membership grade for a number of years such that when added to their age, the sum equals or exceeds 95. As life members of ASCE, these members have represented to the people of this country the true nature of our people-serving profession. They have endured many obstacles as they paved the way for us practicing today, as well as future generations. And without their tenacity, we would not experience our enhanced quality of life. Civil engineers are routinely the unsung heroes of the built environment. And today, these new life members are being singled out for their contributions to the health, safety, and economy of our nation and the world. Congratulations to all our new life members.
Howdy, my name is Sean Merrill, and as a past ASCE Dallas Branch President, I am pleased to serve this year as the ASCE Dallas Branch Honors Chair. Applications are now open for the ASCE Dallas Branch Engineer of the Year and Young Engineer of the Year awards. Please take the time to nominate a deserving civil engineer today. The Engineer of the Year award recognizes established engineers who have made outstanding contributions to the civil engineering profession, public welfare, and humankind. Below you can see the 7 evaluation criteria for this prestigious award. The Young Engineer of the Year award recognizes young engineers who have made outstanding contributions to the civil engineering profession in their communities during their early years of their career. To be eligible for this award, the nominee needs to be age 35 or younger as of January 1st, 2021, and a registered professional engineer or EIT in Texas. Again, you can see the 6 evaluation criteria below. Award forms are located on the ASCE Dallas Branch website and in the article within the monthly branch newsletter. Email your completed nomination forms and all other documentations to myself, Sean Merrill, before Friday, December 18th, 2020. Winners will be honored during a special ceremony in 2021. Past winners are currently honored on our branch website. Please feel free to check them out. We look forward to seeing lots of nominations for these 2 prestigious awards. Thank you.
Ho, ho, ho! Well, for many of y'all, that's a familiar sound, and for the new people, you may not know what that's for, but the WBAP, it's getting to see that time for Christmas, and we're helping raise funds for the Denton State Supported Living Center. This is a place that basically it's a ward of the state where the state takes care of mentally challenged adults who may not have parents or somebody to take care of them. So this year, we want to go once again raise funds. In the past, we've raised over $25,000 over the last 13 or 14 years. And so this year, I want to do that again. I want to provide you that opportunity to give money. Normally, as you know, I'm outside our meetings taking cash, but this year is a little different. So this year, I have set up both a Venmo account and a Zelle account, and then there's also the good old-fashioned checks, which some of us older people like me still write, not the younger people. But I tell you what, we'll put that information on the slides, and we want to just encourage you to help support this Denton State Supported Living. So have a Merry Christmas.
As we enter into the new ASCE year, I would also like to take a moment to recognize all of the committee chairs that help support our board of directors. These volunteers are fantastic leaders and truly are the driving force behind our branch. Each of these members are going above and beyond the call of duty, and I am extremely excited as the Dallas branch president to see all of their ideas come to life this year. We would also like to thank their employers for supporting them in their efforts to serve and lead the ASCE Dallas branch into the future. Without the support of all the companies you see listed on the screen, our branch would not be as successful as it is. I would now like to welcome the Society of American Military Engineers Dallas Post to our branch meeting. Every year in the month of November, our two organizations come together to break bread. I'm glad that we are continuing this tradition even in the virtual era we currently find ourselves in. I would like to introduce SAME Dallas Post Programs Director Jim O'Brien and allow him to give an update on what the Dallas Post has happening this year.
Good afternoon. I'm Jim O'Brien, the program chair for the Dallas Post of the Society of American Military Engineers. On the call today is our incoming president, Colonel retired Juan Saldivar, Director of Real Estate Operations for Army Air Force Exchange Service. SAME celebrates its 100th anniversary this year. Recognizing that World War I pivoted on technology, arguably the first time in history for warfare, Major General William M. Black, the U.S. Army Chief of Engineers in 1919, appointed a 9-officer board to consider the formation of an association of engineers that would preserve and expand upon connections formed in war and promote the advancement of engineering and its related professions across both government and civil. As stated in the January 1920 issue of the Military Engineer magazine, we are establishing at this time a Society of American Military Engineers. The society will serve no selfish purpose. It is dedicated to patriotism and national security. Its objects are, in brief, to promote solidarity and cooperation between engineers in civil and military life, to disseminate technical knowledge bearing upon progress in the art of war and the application of engineering science thereto, and to preserve and maintain the best standards and traditions of the profession, all in the interests of patriotism and national security. SAME's mission is to build leaders and lead collaboration among government and industry to develop multidisciplinary solutions national security infrastructure challenges. The Dallas Post mission is to lead collaborative efforts to identify and resolve national security infrastructure related challenges. The Dallas Post annually sponsors the SAME Dallas Water Resources Summit and did so again this year virtually and included a keynote speech by Director Kathleen Jackson, the Texas Water Development Board. We had a half-day event and heard from numerous North Texas water districts. We also annually join with the Fort Worth Post for a Resiliency and Emergency Response Seminar, virtual this year also. This year it focused on COVID-19 and the Dallas tornado response. We've been continuing with our normal third Monday luncheons, all virtual since March. And next week, coincidentally, SAME National is hosting their annual small business convention, which last year attracted more than 3,500 participants from businesses large and small, government and military. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you, Jim. We are excited to have the SAME Dallas Post watching with us today. The ASC Dallas branch virtual meetings will continue to be free to watch online via our YouTube channel. However, starting this month, we will be charging a $10 fee for the PDH certificates. The proceeds from the PDH certificates will be split evenly between the ASCE Dallas branch GB Man Scholarship and a rotating charity or nonprofit. This month, we will be donating to the Christmas is Caring charity drive that you just heard ASCE Dallas member Quinn Spann talk about. You can visit our branch website at www.dallasasce.org or click in the link in the video description below to pay for and obtain your PDH certificate. The PDH certificates will be available for purchase for 2 weeks after the live premiere of this month's meeting. We will now get started with the main meeting presentation. If you have any comments or questions during the presentation, you can type them into the chat to the right of the presentation. To introduce our main speaker, I will now pass it off to our ASE Dallas Branch Programs Chair, Carlos Valderrama.
Howdy, everyone. We're very excited to introduce Patrick Miles with Friesen Nichols as November branch meeting speaker. Patrick will be taking a look at a really cool local project that we have that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the area in the White Rock Lake Dredging Feasibility Study. Patrick is a licensed professional engineer with Friesen Nichols, and he specializes in H&H modeling for dams, levees, canals, and spillways. It was really cool to learn from Patrick that he actually likes to teach this knowledge that he's gathered to other people by hosting HECRAS 2D training seminars, both for state agencies, and he's actually spoken nationally as well. As I mentioned earlier, he's a licensed engineer in Texas, but he's also licensed in 7 other different states. Without further ado, I will pass it on to Patrick Miles here so he can tell us all about the White Rock Lake Dredging Feasibility Study.
Awesome. Thank you, Carlos, and thanks everybody for tuning in to this. Again, as Carlos said, my name is Patrick Miles. I'm a water resources engineer with Friesen Nichols, based in our Fort Worth office, actually, so don't hate me for that. Yeah, so our group specializes in dams, reservoirs, levees, large water infrastructure, things like that. And we have been fortunate to partner up with the City of Dallas, primarily the Dallas Park and Recreation Department and Dallas Water Utilities for this study. So White Rock Lake is obviously an important natural asset to really all of the citizens and surrounding communities of Dallas. And as you may have realized if you've been out there or heard folks talking about White Rock, it does have some sedimentation issues. And so that's what prompted our study, this dredging feasibility study, and we'll get into a little bit more later about what that feasibility word means. But first, let's talk a little bit about the lake itself. Originally constructed in 1910 as the original water supply reservoir for the City of Dallas, White Rock is now only a recreational lake. So the water supply benefits have been abandoned a long time ago, and now it's this beautiful natural gem in the middle of the City of Dallas. Excuse me. Excuse me. As you probably know, there's an over 9-mile hike and bike trail around the lake. A lot of natural features, places where you can go enjoy a nice, spring day with your family and friends. So a lot of folks make use of White Rock Lake, whether it's the lake itself for sailing, kayaking, etc., or the trails and natural areas around the lake. So it's obviously very important to the city. One thing you may not know, though, is that over the, 110-year life of the lake, originally constructed in 1910, it's been dredged 4 times in the 30s, 50s, 70s, and most recently in the mid-90s. So on that about every 20-year or so cycle, the lake has been dredged for various reasons. 1937 saw the first dredging project. 400,000 cubic yards of sediment were removed from the lake at that time. It took almost 3.5 years to complete that project. That large undertaking was in large part done in the dry, actually. From what we've heard about the historic records, there were some droughts going on in that time period, and part of the reason they were able to excavate as much as they did was because a lot of it was above water, surprisingly. So moving forward into the 1950s, 55 and 56, only about 15,000 cubic yards of sediment removed at that time. We don't have a whole lot of information about that dredge project other than that volume. But in the 70s, it started getting larger. So almost 1.5 million cubic yards of sediment were removed. A lot of that was actually utilized to rebuild some marshy areas around the lake. So this actually created Mockingbird Point, the area near the dog park in the northwest corner of the lake, if you're familiar. Side note, today with the range of environmental regulations, et cetera, that sort of land reclamation would probably not be permittable. Then the most recent dredge completed in 1998. This one really served as a good benchmark for us for our study. So really presented a lot of good information of what they learned in the 90s. We actually had access to the city staff member who was the project manager on the city side during this dredging project. And so we're able to learn a whole lot from that effort. Almost 3 million cubic yards of sediment were removed in that dredging project. It was funded by 2 different bond programs totaling $18 million. Now, one thing that's really important to realize about the dredging that occurred in the 90s is there's a lot that went really well. They had a lot of good things fall into place, really the biggest of which was that a landowner down in Hutchins, Texas, had a gravel pit, a quarry, that had completed its serviceable life and needed to be filled in. Okay, and so this landowner worked out a deal with the city to basically pump all of the dredge materials from White Rock Lake to his gravel pit. He accepted all that material, dewatered it on site, and basically filled in the pit with that. That really reduced the cost. And as we'll talk about here in a little bit, dewatering and disposal for a dredging project is really probably the largest single cost driver when it comes to figuring out how much that costs. But the dredge barge was located in the lake and pumped out sediment through a 24-inch pipe for almost 9 months straight. So quite a large activity, as you can imagine. A lot of folks around the lake still remember that effort, and so through our public involvement components, we learned a lot more. You know, just folks that had experiences with the dredge, folks that had memories of not only what happened, but really even how it came to be, and that was really helpful to shaping our study. So let's talk a little bit about this project in particular. As I said, it is a feasibility study. So what does that mean? Really want to emphasize feasibility on this. This is very high level. We're not developing any engineering plans, permit applications. There's really not even any final alternative selected for this. So it's very high level. Really the goals here were to really define what would be the purpose of a potential dredging project, and then to help the city understand really the range of possible solutions and what the potential costs might be. And so I emphasize that because, you know, when we start looking at some of these cost ranges, you'll see that there's quite a bit of variability just because there's a lot of unknowns at this point. So this is really very much the early stages of what could become a dredging project at White Rock Lake. So really just want to emphasize that. Talking specifically about our study, the timeline, this started back in December of last year. Did a lot of data collection, right? So as we mentioned, these historic dredging events, that there was a lot to learn from, some site visits, as well as beginning the process of gathering community input. As we mentioned, this is a very recreational centered lake, and so because of that, there are a lot of people that care deeply about it, and we really from the beginning of this project wanted to make sure, and it was our directive from the city of Dallas to make sure that as much community input was incorporated as possible. And so we started that with an online survey and a public meeting in January. We took that information, started cranking through our analysis. Obviously, we had some delays with the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic that pushed back our second public meeting. But after we did that analysis, we researched some funding. We did present the draft findings of the study in July via a virtual public meeting, and then took all of that input, gathered it together, and synthesized everything into a final feasibility study report, which was published right at the end of September, so just about a month ago. As I mentioned, public involvement is really a key component of this study. And so you can see here highlighted really the some of the primary ways that we gathered input from online surveys, poll questions. We did have 2 public meetings, one in January and the one in July. As I mentioned, the one in July did get converted to a virtual Zoom meeting, but we did have almost 100 folks log in and show up. And so you really reinforce the concept that folks really do care about White Rock Lake, and they want to know and they want to have a voice in what happens at the lake, and that was extremely important. From all of that, we really gathered that there are these 4 primary goals of a potential dredging project, right? So as we mentioned, there's no longer a water supply component to White Rock Lake. It has very little, if any, impact on flood control, definitely no official flood control benefits. And so the only real goal here was recreational, environmental, aesthetic improvement to the lake, right? So primary to that, restoring lake depth to enhance water sport recreation. So primarily sailing, kayaking, etc. And then, also the water side recreation as well. So number 2 there, improving the lake itself, both removing sediment, improving aesthetics, so that everyone visiting the lake is improved. So not just focusing on the boating aspect, but really the health and well-being of the entire lake. Obviously, we want to minimize any negative environmental impacts to the aquatic habitat itself or any of the environmentally sensitive areas surrounding the lake. So that was a key component. And then finally, we want this to be any of the solutions we propose, we want to be long-term strategies, right? We want them to be sustainable. We recognize that in all reservoirs, and particularly reservoirs in urbanized areas and of the size that White Rock Lake is, all of them have to deal with sedimentation in one way or another, right? So silt is going to flow down White Rock Creek continuing in the future. And so we want whatever solution we propose, whatever program we propose, to be sustainable, right? So first step there is really determining how much sediment is in the lake and where it's at, right? And so, and I should say a lot of this, or the volumetric analysis here, is based on a 2015 bathymetric survey, so a survey of the lake bottom, performed by the Texas Water Development Board in partnership with the City of Dallas. So major kudos to the City of Dallas for working with TWDB to get this reservoir surveyed at the time that it was, because it probably would not have been without their efforts. So 2015 survey is what's really the basis of most of this data. Now, we recognize that, yeah, it's been 5 years since that survey happened. And so, we did have to make some assumptions to expand and escalate things a little bit further beyond 2015, right? So, but really the first thing we want to do is, because we're focused on recreation, we recognize that there are portions of the lake that are deep enough, right, that don't need additional depth, right? And so what we've done is we've highlighted in blue in this figure on the right the areas of the lake at 10 feet or less in depth, right? And so in conversations with the various boating groups, the sailing clubs, rowing clubs, as well as just our own research about water sport recreation, we really set this target depth of about 8 feet. So at about 8 feet, the lake is good and usable for recreational activities. We then further subdivided the lake, and again, this is some based on geography and some based on community input, subdivided the lake into these areas in the dashed red lines. And so what this allows us to do is to understand how much sediment is in each region of the lake. Okay, and the lines are somewhat arbitrary, but they help just kind of segment up the lake. Because, for example, you may have some areas that you want to dredge to a deeper depth, and some that may not need as deep of a depth. For example, Sunset Bay on the east side of the lake is very much a birding location, right? And so there are a lot of bird communities, waterfowl communities that either migrate through that area or call that area home. And so because of that, there's not as much boating activity. So you may not need to dredge it to the full 8-foot depth. Whole purpose there is just giving the city flexibility in developing and custom fitting a dredging program. Another component that was really critical to our study is trying to wrap our hands around how much sediment enters White Rock Lake on an annual basis. Now, for any of you who have dealt with reservoirs, tried to develop a sedimentation rate for a specific reservoir, you'll know that there's a lot of variability in that, right? So there are a lot of different factors that affect sedimentation, and it varies wildly from year to year. But our goal was to try to get a good average number, and so based off of the history of the lake, so including the 4 dredging projects and a few different bathymetric surveys in between there, we developed this number of about 170,000 cubic yards per year entering the lake on an average basis. And that's what this chart on the right shows you. So the orange line is the actual storage capacity of the lake. You can see it's at 100% starting in 1910, and then it's gradually decreasing over time by this about 170 cubic yards per year number. Definitely recognize there's variability in that number, but it helped us to just, for the planning purposes, to have something to project forward. And you can see we've even projected that line beyond 2020, which is shown by the vertical black dashed line as decreasing on further into the future. The blue line below just shows us what the lake would have done without any of the dredging projects in previous history. Additionally, we wanted to do some screening level environmental sampling of both the reservoir sediments and the water itself, so we would call it an eleuteria sample, so the water near the surface. And so we did collect quite a few samples in various areas of the reservoir. The goal here really just, again, screening level, trying to understand and identify if there are any areas that we need to look out for, any red flags. And so in the sampling process, they measure what's called chemicals of concern, so COCs. So these are just chemicals that are present in water bodies and may cause concern if they're above certain thresholds. The goal here was really just to determine if there might be any special handling requirements of a dredging project, if there are any limitations on the what can be done with the sediment after it's removed, how we could dispose it. And you know, the general findings of the study that the COCs were all below allowable thresholds, such that the concentrations would not pose any substantial risk to dredging contractors if they're actually doing the dredging activities, nor any risk to the lake environment itself. The sediment also appears to meet criteria for landfill disposal applications, so meaning you wouldn't have to do any additional permitting or mitigating for landfill disposal. However, there is some additional analysis that would be needed if you were looking at a beneficial reuse or land application scenario where you're spreading the sediment in just an open area. And that's normal for a dredging project. As I said, this was screening level sampling, and the goal was really just to get the red flag. So good news results for a dredging project as related to the sampling results, which really kind of give us the clear. There weren't any particular areas with concerns that we knew we would need to watch out for a future dredging project. So now that we know how much sediment is in the reservoir and more or less that it would be okay to remove it, that it wouldn't cause any environmental concerns to remove it, we needed to start looking at actually how to physically do the dredging process itself, as well as what to do with the dredge materials once it's gone. So for a dredging project, there are really a number of ways to physically remove the sediment materials. So there's mechanical dredging, which you could do with a backhoe or a system of cables and a mechanical dredge that's cable driven. Or you can do hydraulic dredging, and that's where you've got a barge in the middle of the lake that has a suction hose, basically, that's just pumping out sediment slurry into a pipeline that then transports it away. And it really comes down to a matter of scale. So for a project of the scale that we're talking about for White Rock, hydraulic dredging just makes more sense. Mechanical dredging might make sense in very small scale applications, but for a lake of this size and dealing with as much sediment as it would be, hydraulic dredging really was primary, made the most sense from a cost standpoint. Just for a couple examples here, so the photo in the upper right is a dredge barge sitting in the middle of the lake, and then on the bottom right is the red and black apparatus is the cutter head. So that is at the end of the suction line, basically on the bottom of the lake, breaking up and cutting through the sediment so that it can be extracted from the lake through the suction line. And that then gets pumped to a staging area on shore and then further pumped to the disposal and dewatering site. Throughout the process, we had a lot of questions about, is that really going to make the water muddy, or is it going to smell, or, all these different concerns. And really, from what we have seen in past dredging projects and just research in general, the area of disturbance, you can see the barge is not small, right? But that area of disturbance is really limited to just a small radius around the barge itself. And so obviously, if you were kayaking on the lake, you would need to avoid the barge, but they typically will put out buoys and things like that. But really, it's other than just that where the barge is located, the disturbed area isn't too bad. The suction line actually does a really good job of removing the sediment, but there were definitely some folks that were concerned. But I think the impact, not only is the cost impact lower with hydraulic dredging, but I think just the physical impact is less as well. So one thing to note about hydraulic dredging, and this is going to come into play when you think about how to dispose of it, that slurry that it extracts, we use a rule of thumb that it's about 90% water. Okay, and so if you think about that, that means that once you pump it out of the lake, you have to do something with all that water, right? So you have to remove the water from the sediment, and so there's a lot of different ways to do that as well. Some are more mechanical, like belt presses, where you actually squeeze the water out of the sediment. Again, that's a little bit more applicable for a small scale dredging operation where you only have a small amount of sediment to remove. What we think would be most applicable for this will be basically constructing large settling basins where the sediment can fall out of the water, and then that water can be pumped off from those cells, those basins. And so if you think about that, that means that there's going to be a decent amount of land that's needed just for dewatering. And so we start thinking about that and realizing, okay, we've got a large volume of sediment, we've got a large land area for dewatering it. You begin to understand why that dewatering and disposal can be such a significant component. Obviously, ideally, you would like to dewater the sediment at the same location where you're going to dispose of it. So for example, in the 90s, they dewatered it right adjacent to the gravel pit where it was going to be deposited. It just went straight in, and really I think the gravel pit served as the settling basin itself. That's ideal. What you want to avoid, if possible, is double handling. So a case where you dewater the sediment at one site, but then have to truck it off to a different site for disposal. That obviously just has a lot of cost implications. And as I'm sure you're aware, with just the location of White Rock Lake in general being quite urban, there's not a lot of open land around White Rock Lake itself, and the land that is open is often either environmentally sensitive, like the land surrounding the lake. I know there's a lot of particular grasslands, wildflowers that grow there, and so that's not an option. You also don't want to place fill in the regulatory floodplain, because then you have either major permitting issues or, you know, Lomer-Clomer issues, or potentially not even being possible at all. And so you want to avoid that. And so you can see this map is highlighted in red is city-owned parcels of land. So this was kind of our first take. Okay, this is where does the city own land that they might be able to place it? Well, as you can see, a lot of these, the larger parcels are also either fully developed already. I believe one of them is actually Fair Park. You know, we're definitely not going to be placing any dredge materials at Fair Park. And so you begin to see that there's a bit of a challenge for where to take this sediment and what to do with it. In addition to the dewatering question, there's also the final disposal question. And so landfill disposal, which we have from our sediment sampling have determined that's viable, can be costly, $30 to $60 per ton, depending on where you are. And apologize that I realize this map is probably fairly small for you guys, but you can see we did have to expand to the whole Metroplex effectively and a little bit beyond to try to understand, you know, where might we be able to take the sediment material. The pink dots are landfills, so mostly municipal landfills. The McComas Bluff, which is City of Dallas landfills, they're almost straight south from White Rock Lake. I'll also point out, if you can see it, the blue dot that's about southeast from White Rock Lake, right along the Trinity River, is the location of the disposal site from the 1998 dredge, so that quarry where it was disposed. We've also highlighted a handful of additional active quarries and gravel pits with the red dots. Again, as a feasibility study, we definitely were not trying to identify any specific sites for either dewatering or disposal, really just trying to present the range of possibilities. As with any project, there are obviously environmental considerations, and particularly given the natural asset that White Rock Lake is, even more so. So we did just a high-level desktop analysis of environmentally sensitive areas surrounding the lake. As you can see, there are a lot of areas that you would not want to be either placing materials or staging construction, etc. And so we recognize that it's going to be fairly tight to execute and accomplish a dredging project, just from a figuring out where to place your construction staging areas, you know, where does the dredge barge launch from, those kinds of things. And so we wanted, again, to just kind of be able to have a sense of what might be feasible, recognizing that there are environmental concerns, there are public access and recreational concerns. You know, we certainly would not want to, you know, block off any of the trails or any of the streets around the lake. And so definitely a lot that has been and will continue to need to be considered with a potential dredging project at White Rock. From an environmental permitting standpoint, obviously you have permits at the local, state, and federal level. Really the most significant one here being from the Corps of Engineers, Section 404 permit, which, because of the nature of the dredging activities may require an EA, an environmental assessment. Again, that formal EA in the Corps of Engineer language has not been performed as of yet. Really, once the magnitude of the dredging project is selected, we'll kind of define how that permit process will go. There's also some secondary park and wildlife and historical permitting at the state level, and obviously fish and wildlife at the federal level for threatened and endangered species. So with all of this in mind, again, we as engineers, we want solutions, right? And so we really sought to develop a range of alternatives that would present what's possible. Again, this is a feasibility study. We want to understand the range of what could happen. And so as such, we really tried to just focus on that aspect of a range. And so we developed 4 possible alternatives, and really, I don't think any of these represent, the golden ticket. None of these are this exact scenario is what would be proposed, but it gives a sense of the range. And then the other thing that's really important, or that was really important to us, is to provide the city with enough data that they could interpret and manipulate and size a dredging program to fit to fit the needs of the community and to fit the available funding, right? And so there is a lot of data in the background of all this that can be toggled. There's a whole lot of variables, as you can imagine. And so these 4 alternatives represent the range of what could be possible. So starting out, we have the baseline scenario. So this represents something similar to what has been performed in the past. So dredging every 20 to 25 years. I'll introduce you to this graph on the right. The orange line is obviously the sedimentation rate if we did nothing. So you can see starting from the 1998 dredging operation, we have a data point at the 2015 bathymetric survey, and then today, projecting that forward, the lake will continue to decrease. And so the red line is then what these dredging activities might be. So in this baseline scenario, we say, okay, every 20 years approximately, we're going to dredge just over 3 million cubic yards. And you can see the red line spikes up during that dredge project and then begins to decrease again. I point out the black dashed line, that's that threshold depth of the target of 8 feet. So once you dip below that depth, you're beginning to have recreational impacts. Okay, that'll be important in comparing these alternatives as we move forward. So you can see that the baseline scenario, it does have some recreational impacts for a period of a few years before we're able to get around to doing a dredging project to remediate that. And you can feel free to look at the costs and everything on the left-hand side. I'm going to summarize all of that after we get through the alternatives, just so that we're comparing apples and apples. But our first actual alternative says, okay, rather than waiting 20 years between dredge projects, let's dredge every 12 years. And so here we start with a large $3.2 million cubic yard dredging program. And then rather than waiting 20 years, we're going to dredge approximately every 12 years. And in those dredge programs only need to be 2 million yards because we haven't let ourselves get below the threshold. So you can see we stay above that threshold line the whole time. Alternative 2 is a completely different approach to dredging, right? Instead of doing large dredge programs infrequently, we're going to establish an annual maintenance dredging program. So alternative 2 considers a one-time medium-sized dredge of just over 1 million cubic yards followed by annual maintenance dredging, where you're basically just dredging whatever comes in. Again, based on our estimate of historical data, about 170,000 cubic yards on average. Okay, so and that just keeps you at the desired depth, the threshold depth. Alternative 3 kind of takes that approach and adjusts it a little bit, where instead of having a large initial dredge, you just have a little bit more aggressive annual dredging for the first 12 years. So for 12 years, you're trying to catch up to the threshold depth, and that takes about 250,000 cubic yards per year. And then after that, you're just staying at the 170,000 cubic yards. Alternative 4, and I kind of call this our hybrid model. This basically combines large dredging programs infrequently with intermediate maintenance dredging. So you can see this one, you start off again with that 3.2 million to get it up to the desired level. And then rather than annual dredging, you're going to dredge 250,000 cubic yards every 3 years. Okay, and what that basically does is that buys you time, that extends the time between your large dredge projects. Okay, and so you see, if you recall in alternative 1, we had a large dredge project every 12 years. Now here with alternative 4, we have large dredge projects every 20 years. Okay, and so you've got every 3 years, 250,000 cubic yards, every 20, just over 2 million cubic yards. I want to mention the concept of a sediment forebay. So the idea here is, why can't we capture the sediment before it even enters White Rock Lake? You know, we understand that it's coming down White Rock Creek, so can't we just capture all of that sediment prior to it entering the lake and then remove it on a semi-regular basis? Well, the challenge with that approach is just a matter of scale. So at the assumed sedimentation rate, 170,000 cubic yards per year, and assuming a 10-year maintenance cycle, so every 10 years you need to come in and effectively dredge out that material from the sediment forebay, you would need about 120 acres to be able to have a facility like that. That would need to be, you know, clear, smooth slopes, smooth surfaces. And as you can imagine, finding 120 acres in urban Dallas is going to be pretty challenging. But then also you need that to be really as close to the lake as you can be. And as you can see from the figure on the right, 120 acres would effectively take out all of the emergent and forested wetlands immediately upstream in the headwaters. So basically between Mockingbird and Northwest Highway, all of that area would need to be converted to a sediment forebay. Because of the wetland concerns, this was really deemed just not viable at all from a permitting standpoint. This was something that, you know, logically it you know, kind of made sense. Several folks had brought it up during the planning phase of this project. And so we wanted to look at it and really make sure that, you know, before we crossed off the list, that it really wouldn't work. And so you can see just from a permitting standpoint, this would be extremely challenging, to the point where we just determined that it was not viable at all. So comparing our 4 alternatives against our baseline scenario, you can see that we have a wide variability in costs. As I mentioned, there's a lot of unknowns still at this point, and so that's why you see these really wide ranges. I will kind of direct your attention to the far right column. Because the dredge frequency and magnitude is quite variable, we decided that it would be best to compare our cost on an annualized basis. So we just selected a 50-year life cycle. That's quite arbitrary, just gave us something to compare everything against. And so you can see, you know, range of cost, the baseline approach, so infrequent large dredging every 20 to 25 years, which would have some recreational impacts, it is going to cost out between $3 and almost $5.5 million per year, annualized over a 50-year life cycle. The rest of your alternatives range between $3.5 million to all the way as much as $8.5 million per year, depending on the dredge scenario. So what's next for this project? There's, I think funding is really the biggest question, as you can imagine. The city has a lot of work to do to determine where funds are going to come from. Likely, based on what we've seen, it would likely be through a bond program of some sort. Some of that's going to depend on the type of dredging program you select, whether it's large infrequent dredging or the more annual maintenance type of dredging programs. That's going to be very dependent on how you formulate the program. Okay, so unfortunately, because the primary purpose of this dredging would be for recreational use, there's really pretty limited to almost no federal or state grants or loan funding available for this kind of thing. As we mentioned, there's no water supply benefit to White Rock Lake anymore, nor any substantial flood control benefit, and so because of that, it really limits what outside funding is available. Now, there are possible alternative sources such as lake user fees, special tax districts, things like that. And I only mention that because it's a possibility. The city's given no indication as to whether or not that's something that they would pursue, so definitely don't take that as such. Just really presenting the range of solutions that may be available for something like this. As far as a project timeline, obviously the very first step is figuring out funding, but then from there, engineering and design would probably be 1 to 2 years, followed by permitting. And the permitting would have a public review and comment period. And I should point out that, as we mentioned previously, public involvement is extremely important to this project. And so highlighting the public review here is really just specific to the permitting process. I think we believe, and I know that city staff believe, that public involvement is critical throughout the life of the project, not just where it's shown here. Then again, depending on the scale of the dredging project, the operations and the dewatering and disposal could last between 1 to 3 years. So once funding is determined, you're looking at probably a 3 to 5 year process before the dredge project could be completed. So finally, what are our recommendations from this project? We've obviously looked at a lot of data, both engineering data and public involvement, community input data. And so here really what our primary recommendations are. Number one, as I mentioned, it's so important to continue to coordinate with the community groups to get their involvement. We want the public's voice to be heard for this project. Secondly, identifying where and how to dewater and dispose of the dredge materials is going to be really critical. These materials, there's disposing of them, as we've said, is really one of the largest cost drivers, probably the largest cost driver overall. And so identifying what that location and how that's going to happen, as well as any possible reuse opportunities. If there's a way that some of this material can be used for open land application, beneficial reuse, that would really cut down costs. Obviously, evaluating the funding is going to be a critical component as well. And then finally, scaling the operation to the funds available. Figuring out how much is available, and then from that, scaling up or down what the dredging program might look like. So with that, I will open up to any questions you all have. But before that, I just want to say thank you again for tuning in, for listening to this. Thank you to City of Dallas, Park and Recreation Department, and Dallas Water Utilities for giving us the opportunity. I know on behalf of the project team, this has been an extremely interesting project. While dams, reservoirs, et cetera, is something that we specialize in, dredging projects aren't things that come around, all the time, especially in an upland reservoir scenario. And so it's been very interesting. It's had its challenges, and both. So it's been a lot of fun on both the engineering side and just understanding the community involvement, understanding the value that people put on White Rock Lake. And so, yeah, with that, definitely happy to field any questions you guys have.
Patrick, Jim O'Brien here.
Hey, Jim.
Very, very good presentation. Thank you. I've got a couple of questions. First one, from a regulatory and particularly 404 standpoint, how pure does the return water need to be to not be classed as fill?
That's a good question, Jim. And I don't have the numbers directly on hand, but I would imagine that it needs to be, obviously it's not going to be drinking water, but it needs to be lake water, not slurry. And so, that dewatering process definitely needs to drop a lot of the sediment out of it. I will note that in the 90s dredging, I think they actually did not return the water to the lake. The water basically dried up and stayed on site or evaporated on site at the disposal location.
Okay, and I've got one more question for maintenance dredging. Do you need bathymetric surveys each time in order to target the sediments, or does history tell you reliably where the sediments form?
So I think it's kind of a both answer. If you're looking at an annual maintenance dredge program, I wouldn't think that you would need to go survey every single year. But I think with any dredge program, you want to have a decent understanding of the bathymetry as much as you can, right? So I think we would recommend, if you're looking at the more infrequent dredging, that you probably have bathymetric surveys maybe before and after the dredge projects. When you're looking at the annual maintenance dredging, you want to have a good understanding of what you're starting with. But then I do think the history of dredging and just, the physics of it, right? We understand most of the sediment's going to drop out in the upper half of the reservoir, right? Just based on the subsurface topography itself. And so I think you can predict a little bit of where you're going to need the dredging to occur, but you're right, bathymetry data on a somewhat regular basis is going to be meaningful to the process.
Hi, Patrick. This is Juan Saldivar.
Juan.
Hey, great presentation. Dovetailing in there with Jim's question about maintenance dredging and bathymetric surveys, when you were talking to the timeline for capital dredging, you stated, I want to say you stated that the permitting, planning, and design was more or less a 2-year process. So I think you partially answered the question that I've got with your answer to Jim, but I was kind of wondering what would it look like for a maintenance dredging approach or a hybrid approach in terms of planning and design, and would there be a standing permit, and how often would surveys have to be done? Just wondering what that would look like if that was something that your team explored. Thanks.
Yeah, great question. And I think the short answer is it depends, right? So I think for really any of these alternatives, maybe barring the large infrequent alternatives, you would probably want to pursue more of a programmatic approach regarding permitting, such that it's not like you're having to redesign and re-permit every year or even every 3 years. That would definitely slow down the process. And so there are ways through these permits to basically establish a program that says, okay, we're planning to dredge approximately this much at this frequency. And so I think that could be accomplished.
Hey, Patrick, this is Carlos Valderrama. Sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Go ahead, Juan. I had one question, Patrick. So you had multiple past dredges that you looked at, obviously from previous times at White Rock Lake. Was there any lakes here in the DFW area or even in Texas that have been dredged recently that you looked at through the feasibility study?
Yeah, definitely not of the scale of White Rock. Obviously, you have some just general stormwater type detention ponds and things like that that get dredged on occasion, but definitely not of this scale, and also not as comprehensive, right? So this is kind of a reservoir-wide dredging project. Most dredging that occurs primarily here in the state of Texas, at least for lakes, is because your water supply intake has silted up, right? And so a dredging program for that purpose would really just focus around the intake tower. You would dredge out around it. You might even dredge some sort of a channel leading to the intake tower. But for the most part, you're not going to do a reservoir-wide dredging program for water supply purposes.
Thank you, Patrick.
Yeah.
Jim O'Brien again. Understanding that silt-laden water is the key to the sediment dropping out is a velocity issue, standing time, and did you give consideration to kind of a hybrid idea, I would say, of rather than an external forebay, maybe an internal forebay where you dig a very large, deep pit at the upper end of the lake to slow the water down and allow for water dropping out in that area? Or excuse me, sediment.
Yeah, you're right. So no, we didn't look at to use your term, an internal forebay. I like that term. That was a little bit beyond the scope of this project to get into that level of detail. You're spot on about the physics behind what results in the sediment dropping out. In some ways, the reality is the lake does have a bit of, maybe not a forebay, but an afterbay in the deeper portions of the lake, right? So we recognize that there are portions of the lake that are filling in with sediment that really aren't affecting anything yet, and likely won't for a very long time. And so recognize that sediment is going to drop out in different places. And so, yeah, but the short answer to your question, no, we didn't look at a forebay like that, primarily because maintenance of something like that would just be challenging, kind of just a different animal to what we were focused on originally.
Patrick, we want to thank you for being willing to speak to us today. It was great to learn about this unique project at White Rock Lake. As someone who lives less than a mile from the lake, I'm always very interested to hear what's going on there. If anyone watching has any additional questions you would like to ask Patrick, please put those in the comments section below. Those will be collected and emailed to Patrick. Remember, if you would like a PDH for today's presentation, please visit www.dallasasce.org or click the link in the video description below. This link will remain open until November 23rd. As a reminder, based on the guidance and direction from ASCE headquarters, we will be having virtual meetings and events for the remainder of the calendar year. Rest assured, your ASCE Dallas board is constantly evaluating our situation, and we look forward to meeting together sometime in 2021. if and when we feel we can provide an environment that is acceptable for the health, safety, and welfare of our members. If you want to get more involved with the Dallas branch or have ideas on how we can make our branch better, we would love to have you join our leadership team in any capacity. We have several ad hoc committees that are working hard to come up with alternative programming and make our branch better and better every year. Please feel free to reach out to me at president@dallasasce.org to get involved. Next month's meeting is scheduled for December 14th. We will have Michael Morris with the North Central Texas Council of Governments coming in to give a great presentation on the outlook for transportation projects in the Dallas region. Thanks for attending the virtual Dallas branch meeting, and I hope you have a great week. With that, I will adjourn the meeting. Stay safe, everyone.